Well, in the annals of the Old West gunfighters, there's one name that stands head and shoulders above everyone else, and that's Wild Bill Hickok. This guy not only walked the walk, he talked the talk. He almost single handedly created the legend of the town tamer, the one who cleaned up every cow town in the West and could was quicker on the draw than his adversaries. So this guy really had the mojo that was advertised. Now the historians get a few things about him wrong. In fact, when I was growing up in the 60s, that would be the 1960s, there was a movement that was claiming that Wild Bill was effeminate. And the reason was it's because of his long hair, and he had long flowing locks down to his shoulders. And what really had happened is that in World War II, the greatest generation, so called, had all been shave tailed, head shaved, and they came out of that war. And the only haircuts that were kind of available for men were buzz cuts, crew cuts, or flat tops, which is what I wore. And so in the 1960s, when the Beatles and the Rolling Stones came along, a lot of teenagers started wearing their hair longer over their ears, and this really upset the World War II crowd. So the kids were saying, some did, I did, well, what about Wild Bill Hickok? Look at him; he's got long hair. And so we actually had historians who were saying that Wild Bill was probably effeminate, uh, perhaps homosexual, and most certainly un-American. That's how bad the culture wars were. And if you think they're bad now, they've always been kind of ridiculous. And so what was happening was that one generation was judging a previous generation from 100 years ago with a different yardstick than was in actually in use. There's an old saying that the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. Well, when I was doing research for my book on Wild Bill, I actually ran across a newspaper interview with Captain Jack Crawford, who was one of the scouts along with Wild Bill and Buffalo Bill Cody, and he explained why they wore their hair long. And even then, in the newspaper interview, he says that there's a prejudice by some men with our long locks that we wear out west, but here's why we do it. Because the Sioux Indians, they wear their hair long as a taunt to their enemies, and they wear their hair long to say, you want my scalp? Come and get it. And so the scouts, Wild Bill was one of them, they wore their hair long to honor that tradition. And as a matter of fact, he goes on to say that people with short hair were considered to be cowards. This was out west. So the other thing I love about Wild Bill, many things I love about him, but one of the things is his sense of humor. When a journalist asked if all these stories of him were true, his quote is, "Pretty near all these stories are true." Well, that's somebody with a really great sense of humor, because pretty near, of course, covers a lot of territory. And he really had a great sense of humor. Now, he acted as a lawman early. He was elected to city marshal in Monticello Township in Kansas in 1858. And he acted as a lawman, both working for the Army and as a lawman in the cow towns all through the 1850s and up into the 1860s. He quickly learned how to survive because these were rough towns, and these Texas cattle drovers would come in with all their hired hands, and they'd been on the road for 3 months, and they all got paid, and then they all wanted to go out and cause trouble and drink and get drunk. And it was his job to stop them from doing the very thing that they wanted to do. In 1869, he was actually elected Hays City Marshal in Hays City, Kansas, and he survived several assassination attempts. One of them's pretty clever. Bill Mulray is the person's name, who actually got the drop on Hickok and had two pistols on him. And Hickok calmly raised his hand, looking over Mulray's shoulder, and said, Don't shoot him in the back. He's drunk. And Mulray, startled, turned around, and Hickok pulled his own pistols and killed Mulray. Well, in September of that year, he killed another a guy named Strawheim, Sam Strawheim, and the city council, or the voters in the Hayes City, obviously had enough. He was not reelected, and the culture always has this vacillation between two fronts. One side is there's not enough law and order, and then the other side is there's too much law and order, and it just seems to like a ping pong ball going down a pipe. That's the way it was in the Old West for sure, and Hickok suffered from that. In July of 1870, Hickok got in a fight with a group of 7th Cavalry troopers. They were in a saloon, Patty Welch's saloon in Hayes City again. And they obviously had it out for him because the biggest one, Lonigan was his name, came up behind Hickok, bear hugged him, wrestled him to the ground. And before he could get to his pistols, a second trooper, John Kyle, pulled out a Remington pistol, put it in Wild Bill's ear, and pulled the trigger. It misfired. It was one of the luckiest moments of Wild Bill's life. And he was able to get to one of his pistols. He shot Lonigan in the wrist and then in the kneecap, and he was able to get out of his grasp and fight his way to the back of the saloon, where he jumped through a window, taking the glass and the sash with him. The 7th Cavalry went back to the fort. They found reinforcements, and they looked high and low for Wild Bill, but they never found him. Now we get to he has a reputation as a town tamer, and you can imagine with all of these scrapes and near almost killings, he became very suspicious and careful, and he would not go past alleys past dark, and he would not allow anyone to approach him from the rear or from the front. And this is where the legend comes, which is true, is that he would, if he was in a poker game, he demanded to be sitting with his back to the wall so he could see the entire room. In fact, as a town tamer, he took to patrolling the street in the middle of the street. He wouldn't walk on the actual boardwalks. He actually walked in the middle of the street and looked over at both sides to make sure that the saloons were operating, etc. And that's how he survived that long. Well, by 1871, he became a city marshal in Abilene, Kansas, which was the queen of the cow towns at the time. His pay was $150 a month, which is a lot of money in those days. And the council approved for him to put up ordinances that the cowboys could not carry weapons on the street. And of course, this did to make him popular with the cowboys. And then also, the town council was really concerned about cleaning up their act. And so they put an ordinance for him to shut all the bordellos. And that really did not go over well. And he had done that in September of that year. And Abilene was going through a kind of a depression at the time. The cattlemen were not getting the prices that they wanted. In fact, some of the drovers pushed their cattle on to Waterville, Kansas, and some stayed in Abilene, hoping that they could get better prices. And it was with that situation that Hickok was in the Alamo Saloon, and there had been rumors that a gambler, Phil Coe, who was a friend of Ben Thompson, had it in for Hickok, and he said he would get Hickok before the frost, which was on its way, of course. And Hickok was in the saloon, and at about 9 p.m., there was a shot fired outside. And so Hickok went to the front doors, went through the swinging doors, out onto the boardwalk, and there were 50 cowboys. And in the center of them was Phil Coe, and he had a pistol in his hand, and it was smoking. And Wild Bill said, "What's going on here?" And Phil Coe said, "Oh, I was shooting at a stray dog." But as he said this, he reached around behind him and pulled a second pistol and fired point blank at Wild Bill Hickok, who was standing on the boardwalk. One bullet went through Hickok's coat, and the other one thudded between his legs onto the boardwalk. And Hickok immediately pulled his Navy Colt revolvers and fired, hitting Coe in the stomach. One of the bullets went through a cow and hit a couple of the bystanders, cowboys behind him. There was a murmur. They were all reacting, obviously in shock. And so now Hickok is on high alert because there's 49 other of them, and he doesn't know who's going to be coming to Philco's aid. He hears footsteps off to his right, and as he turns to look, he sees a shadow coming down an alleyway, and he sees a pistol, the shadow of a pistol, and the body comes around the corner. He turns, instinctively fires, killing Mike Williams, one of his friends, and the city jailer. Hickok goes into a rage. He demands that the Texans disperse immediately, which they do. It's hard to believe they did. That's the kind of command he had over men at that time. He takes Mike Williams into the Alamo Saloon, puts him on the pool table, and he demands that everyone in there leave. And he said he wanted everybody out of town in a half hour. The entire town is completely deserted in a half an hour. Hickok was remorseful. He paid for Mike Williams' funeral. He apologized publicly to Mike Williams' wife, and he resigned as city marshal. As a matter of fact, he had 5 years to live, but it was the last time he ever worked as a lawman. It's sad. I really believe that he was too good for his own good. He was too fast, and I really think that is the case. He was just too fast for his own good. Now, what's interesting about the newspaper articles about this fight are, when you study them, is that the Kansas newspapers, they portrayed Philco as a, quote, red-mouthed, bawling thug, plug ugly, and a dangerous beast. Meanwhile, in Texas, talking about the same gunfight between Philco and Wild Bill Hickok, they said Philco was a kind and generous-hearted man who was well thought of by everyone who knew him. End of quote. And of course, Hickok is portrayed in the Texas newspapers as a bloodthirsty wretch. End of quote. I think it's really tragic and sad that someone of Wild Bill's stature and his abilities was brought down by the very thing. They say that your greatest strength is your greatest weakness. In the case of Wild Bill, that was certainly true. I need to thank someone, and that's Joseph G. Rosa, the British scholar and writer who rescued Wild Bill Hickok from being basically a glorified Roadrunner cartoon, which is what Hickok was in the 1960s and early 70s. It was Joseph Rosa who I dedicated my book, The Illustrated Life and Times of Wild Bill Hickok, to Joe, because Joe brought out the human being that made Wild Bill actually into a red-blooded human being. He was a mythical character, and for good reason. And we have Joe to thank you for that. And I thank Joe, and I thank you for being interested in these stories of the Wild West. Hey, if you like this video and want to see more of that, comment down below. It really helps, okay? And be sure to hit the subscribe button down below and click on the bell next to it. For Bob Bell, click on the bell, okay?